Hi, I'm Kevin Chisholm, a front-end web developer based in New York City. In this video, I'll introduce you to Mustache.js, a popular JavaScript templating library. Mustache.js makes it significantly easier to separate data from presentation, allowing you to write code that is easier to understand, maintain, and extend. Over the next several minutes, I'll show you how to download Mustache.js and include it in your web page. I'll also walk you through the basics of creating an HTML template that will consume your data and then rendering your template in a web page. There are code examples included with this video. If you look in the code examples folder, you'll notice a file named snippets.js. This file contains small pieces of JavaScript code that we'll use to discuss each topic. The file index.html will be used to demonstrate the sample code. The files style.css and mustache-logo.png are for presentation purposes and will not be referenced specifically during this video. In order to use Mustache.js, you'll first need to include it in your web page. I have the code examples folder on my desktop, and if you look in the root of that folder, you'll see a file named index.html. I'll drag that to my text editor. Look for a comment that says mustache.js script tag goes here. Just below that, we'll put our actual script tag. Also in the root of the code examples folder is a file called snippets.js. At the top of that file is a section named Including Mustache.js on your web page. Below that we have three script tags. The first two script tags use a web-based resource to pull in Mustache.js. In both cases, what they're using is something called a CDN. CDN stands for Content Delivery Network. Some refer to it as Content Distribution Network. A CDN is simply a network of web servers all over the world that serve up the exact same resource, in this case it's mustache.js, and based on your geographical location, they'll serve the closest possible copy. It's designed to help make your web page load faster. I'm going to use word wrap so we can see the code a little bit better. Okay. The second script tag references the exact same file, but it's mustache.min.js. And that just means that it's mustache.js with the comments and white spaces removed. So it's just designed to help, once again, to help make your web page load faster. I can copy one of these script tags and go to index.html and paste that script tag in there, and we now have mustache.js on our web page. I can also use a locally saved copy of Mustache.js. We'll need to download it first, so I'll use the actual resource that we were pulling in, copy it, open my browser, paste it in, and here's the JavaScript for Mustache.js. I can say File, Save Page As. I'll save it to my desktop into the Code Examples folder. Great. And now you'll see that we have a locally saved copy of mustache.js. Then I can use this snippet and paste it into index.html. And now we're using a locally saved copy of mustache.js. Let's go back to the snippets file and take a quick look at how to start creating our HTML template. In the section titled Creating HTML Templates, I have two quick examples. The first one has a string that contains an opening and closing paragraph tag, and inside of that we see something that might be new to you. This is what's called a delimiter in Mustache. I like to call them hooks. And a hook in Mustache simply tells Mustache, hey, we're going to put some data in here. And these hooks are easy to notice by a opening and closing set of double curly braces. The opening and closing double curly braces indicate to Mustache.js, hey, this keyword or property name represents some data I'm going to pass to you, and when you get that data, put it in here. In this second example, I've done essentially the same thing, but now I have two hooks, two sets of opening and closing double curly braces. I have a name property and a title property. These strings aren't doing too much for us, so let's talk about how to render an HTML template in the web page. Rendering an HTML template with Mustache means using what's called the render method. Now, when you include Mustache.js in your web page, just like we did right here, you wind up with a global object called Mustache. That object has a render method. The render method of the Mustache object takes two arguments. The first argument is the template, and that's exactly what we've created up here. And the second argument is the data. It takes the template and the data and returns HTML that's essentially the template with the data injected. In the second example, I have created two variables. Now, normally I wouldn't recommend using all uppercase letters for your variable names, but it's just to kind of emphasize the point here. The template variable is a string. It's very, very similar to the templates we created up here. In this case, I've created a div with the class of data item, and that just allows me to apply some styling, which you'll see later. And I have two of these hooks, just like we discussed earlier. Once again, I'm using the name property from some data we're going to pass to mustache.render, and I have the title property, and those two property names are enclosed in double opening and closing curly braces. I have a second variable called data. That data is an object. This object has two properties, name and title, which correspond to the name and title properties we reference in our template. We then call the mustache.render method and pass it two arguments. The first argument is the template variable. This template variable is the HTML string that we just created, and the data variable is the actual object that we created. It's going to take those two arguments and return HTML. So if I copy this code and go to my browser, I'm going to drag index.html to the browser so we can kind of see what we're doing. I'm going to open the Firebug console. If you're not familiar with Firebug, it's a terrific front-end web developer tool that I highly recommend you install. It works with Firefox. I'll paste the code in, and when I execute the code, we should see some HTML on the left side of the JavaScript console. And we do. So this HTML looks very much like our template, except that instead of the opening and closing curly braces or hooks, we see the actual data. We see James Frost, manager, and that data corresponds to the data object, this variable, which was the second argument passed to the render method of the mustache object. So once again, we called mustache.render, passing it a template and data, and in this case the data was an object. Let's expand our template a little bit so that we use all of the data we have available to us. Back in snippets.js, if you scroll down to the section that says expanding the template, you'll see that I've used the jQuery each method again, but I've changed the template a little bit. It's similar to the previous example, but instead of just using the name and title properties, I'm also referencing the account number and phone properties. So I'm going to paste the data variable into our HTML files so we've got the data available to us. I'll go back to our web page, open it in the text editor, and where it says example code goes here, I'm just pasting in the my data variable so that we have the data available to us. Now if I go back to snippets and scroll down here, I'm going to copy the jQuery each method invocation, go back to our web page, and I'm going to open a JavaScript console and paste this code in. And this is just to kind of prove a point. So when I run this code, you'll see that we now have some new markup in the page. And it looks a little bit different because we're using all four properties of the data, not just name and title, but also account number and phone. I can actually put this in the HTML so that, for example, now we don't see it when the page loads, but if I go back here to index and I paste it in the script tag and save it. Now when the page loads, we actually see all of the data available to us. In the last example, we worked with a piece of data that was fairly small. If you go to snippets.js, you'll see a section titled Rendering a List of Values in a Template. In this example, I've created a variable called myData. MyData is an array, and we can see that because of the opening and closing square brackets. The elements in the array are objects. Each one of these objects is similar to the data object we used in the last example, only it has more properties. There is a name property and a title property, but also phone and account number. The biggest difference here is that instead of working with one object, we're working with multiple objects. And we organize those objects, or those multiple objects, in an array. Below that, we use something called the each method of jQuery. jQuery's each method is a terrific tool that allows you to iterate over data and do something to each piece in the data, or in this case, each object in the array. So inside of each iteration of the each method, I'm going to create an HTML template, and I'm going to use the append method to append that HTML to the body tag. Now, let's take a quick look at the anonymous function that gets passed to the jQuery each method. The first argument is the data, which is my data, which is our array of objects. The second argument to the each method is a function. It takes index as its first argument, which is the numerical index of the current item, and then item, which represents the current item being iterated over. So this each method will basically execute this function 3 times. And the reason is because we have 3 objects in our array. On the first iteration of that function, the item argument will be the first item in the array. On the second iteration, this item argument will be the second item in the array, and so on. So once again, inside of this function, on each iteration, we're creating a variable called HTML. It's an HTML template, just like we created before. And here we see our hooks, our sets of double opening and closing curly braces. We're referencing the name property and the title property of the current item or object that's being iterated over. Then we're calling the render method of the mustache object. Once again, we're passing it the HTML or template and the item, which is the current object. I'm going to copy this code and go into index.html and paste the code where it says example code goes here. I'll save my file and open index.html in the browser. And you'll notice that we have some markup. And this markup should correlate to our data. Now, one point I want to make is that if we look at the source code of this page, you'll see that we have the body tag and we have a header tag, but we don't have any other markup below that. We have the Mustache.js script, and then we have our example code that created the HTML that you see. So the point being there is that this HTML does not actually exist in the page when it loads. We created it using Mustache. I can illustrate that by taking the example code out of the page. I'll cut it out and save it. We'll go back to the page and reload the page, and as you can see, that data is no longer in the page. I'll open the Firebug console, paste our code in, and then execute our code, and now you'll see that the markup is there. So what happened was Mustache took this data, and then 3 times it took an HTML template and the data, and it inserted the hooks, such as name and title, into the markup and returned the markup, and we appended that markup to the body. And the end result is 3 DOM elements that contain our data. In this video, we were introduced to Mustache.js, a JavaScript templating library that facilitates separation of presentation and data in your code. We discussed how to include Mustache.js on your web page and the basics of creating HTML templates. After building our HTML template, we injected it into a web page by iterating over the data and using the render method of the Mustache object, which populated our HTML with the data. Thanks for taking the time to view this video. I hope it's helped you to get up and running with Mustache.js.